This is the In Context podcast with your host, Karin von Hippel.
Welcome to In Context, RUSI's podcast. I'm Karin von Hippel, and in these podcasts, we interview a number of really fascinating people. Today, we will be speaking to the Honourable Alexander Downer, a former Australian politician and diplomat. Good afternoon, and welcome to this week's In Context podcast with me, Karin von Hippel, interviewing the Honourable Alexander Downer, AC. He is a former Australian politician and diplomat, leader of the Liberal Party from 94 to 95, longest-serving Minister for Foreign Affairs from 1996 to 2007, and we'll get to some of those issues a bit later. Obviously, High Commissioner to the United Kingdom from 2014 to 2018. And I think as part of your current portfolio today, you are establishing a new diplomatic training course at King's College, and we'll get to that too a bit later. But most importantly, he is a distinguished fellow of RUSI. So welcome, Alexander Downer.
Thank you, Karin.
Today, we will talk about your career. We'll talk a bit about Brexit, perhaps, China, and maybe if we can twist your arm, a bit about your role in the Trump-Russia affair. So let's just start out. You're from Adelaide. You come from a very distinguished political family. Your father was a politician and diplomat, as well as High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, right?
Yes, he was, yeah.
And then also your grandfather, Sir John Downer, was the Premier of South Australia 2 times in the 80s. So tell us a bit about your interesting family legacy, and did you feel from day one you had to be a politician?
I didn't really, and my father wasn't in favour of me being a politician. He thought, and people who know me will laugh at this, he thought that I would be too sensitive for the rough and tumble world of politics. So he tried to persuade me to stick with diplomacy. Why
is that? Were you a sensitive child?
I don't think I could compare myself to others, and that's a relative term. We all have a degree of sensitivity, I suppose, and it's easy, as they say, to be sensitive about yourself. It's harder to be sensitive about others, so that's what you should concentrate on. But I was always very interested in politics, at least from the age of about 15 or 16, and at university I was a political activist and in the university debating team, and I was the chairman of the University Politics Society and so on. So I enjoyed being a young diplomat. I really did enjoy it, and I was the third secretary, subsequently promoted to second secretary at the Australian mission to the European Union in Brussels. So I had an early introduction to the world of the EU. But I really wanted to be making the decisions rather than advising people on the decisions. And so that's why I went into politics.
I see. So you switched from being a diplomat to a politician, although both of them do have authority in different ways, obviously. And you have continued to go back and forth, haven't you?
Yes, diplomats have influence.
Right.
Well, not all politicians, but when I was the foreign minister, I was able to make the decisions.
Right.
Sometimes they would be cabinet decisions. Sometimes decisions would be made in consultation with the prime minister. Mm-hmm. But often you just make decisions on your own as a foreign minister. So that's a very big difference from being an ambassador or a second secretary.
Yeah.
When you're just writing talking points for the minister.
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting distinction, actually. I hadn't thought about it between being an elected politician and being a civil servant, essentially. And both, I suppose it really does depend on your bosses or leaders at the time, how much leeway you get to do your own thing, right?
Well, civil servants, by definition, have a lot of influence over their political masters, or to put it another way around, because that's rather a journalistic way of putting it. When you're a minister, you don't have time to examine in detail every single issue that comes across your desk. So you have to take quite a lot of it at face value from the civil servants. The civil servants should have some understanding of your priorities and your philosophy and your world view. They should be sensitive enough to understand that. And then as a minister, you have to assume they've done that, and they, for their part, have done the homework and produced the advice that you can quickly sign off on.
But I think both being an MP and being a diplomat are very good exercises for broadening your mind, because it's the same that would apply to an MP, especially when you're, representing your constituency, but you're also on all sorts of committees dealing with domestic or international issues. I mean, you really do have to be smart about many, many things. You have to rely on the people who support you, right?
So what people forget about MPs is that they're very in touch with the community, because they're dealing not just with one or two demographics, which in most workplaces is what you do deal with. They're dealing with a full cross-section of the community, from the rich and powerful to the most humble of occupations, to the homeless. Right. So, you literally do deal with the full spectrum of humanity in your constituency as a local MP. And so regardless of whether your constituency is a conservative constituency or a socialist constituency, it will nevertheless include the full range of people. And the second thing is, as an MP, you have to deal with all sorts of issues. So you might be dealing, in Australia's case, with Indigenous affairs one day. You might be dealing with foreign policy. You might be dealing with tax policy, social security policy, environment policy, and so on. So when you become a minister and you're part of the cabinet is considering all of those things as well, and you're part of the cabinet submission process and discussion. So you do tend to end up with a very, very comprehensive understanding of government.
Right. And lots of, especially in your career, because you've gone back and forth so many times, you've really been able to inform each new job by your past experience as well. I'm not talking about just increasing and moving up the ranks, but vacillating between a politician and a diplomat. That's pretty rare the way you've done it, isn't it? You were essentially retired and then you came back in to be High Commissioner here.
So what happened was I left politics because I just felt I didn't want to do it anymore. I'd had enough of it. Whether I should have or not, I don't know. But anyway, I did. To go and work for the United Nations.
On Cyprus, right? You were the special representative.
So I was what's called the special representative to the Secretary General, which is an Under-Secretary General position. And so I presided over the Cyprus peace talks, the talks that go on forever.
Yeah. So you were there before Espen Ida, right? Wasn't Espen involved in that?
Yes, I was his immediate predecessor. And Alvaro de Soto's successor, though there was a gap between him and me of a couple of years. I found that really a really interesting job, of course a very narrow job compared to what I'd been doing as a foreign minister, but nevertheless enjoyed remaining involved in the diplomatic space, I suppose. Then I became the High Commissioner in London. So all of those things were somewhat similar, but with substantial differences, nevertheless.
Right. It's really interesting, though. I hadn't really thought about that. But let's go back a bit earlier to when you were foreign minister, because I think because you were there for so long, almost 11 years, right?
Yes, nearly 12 years, 3 months short of 12 years, I always say.
Wow. But you did a lot. You brokered a peace agreement in Papua New Guinea. Was that working with New Zealand, right?
Yes. New Zealanders played an important part in that. So there was a man called Don McKinnon who subsequently became the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, very much retired now. He and I really made it. It's one of those situations where it was a great success. So it has 1,000 fathers, as great successes always do. So the Papua New Guineans and the Bougainvillean people themselves all were central to these negotiations. What Don McKinnon and I did was facilitate the negotiations.
Can you maybe explain a bit more about the conflict for people who don't know?
Right. So Bougainville is an island off the east coast of Papua New Guinea, part of Papua New Guinea, adjacent to the Solomon Islands. So ethnically, the people have more in common with the Solomon Islands than with Papua New Guinea. There was a huge copper mine there at a place called Panguna. And the traditional landowners there revolted against the terms under which the mine had been built and closed down the mine. And what and claimed independence for Bougainville. And the Papua New Guinea government was hugely opposed to any of its many provinces breaking off, fearing the balkanisation of the whole country, and Australia certainly shared those fears. So the Papua New Guinea government very heavy-handedly went in and cracked down, or tried to crack down, on this revolt, and what erupted was a civil war, essentially.
Right.
Started in the late 1980s. The mine was closed. As a result of the mine closing, the Papua New Guinea lost something like 20% of all of their annual revenue. So it was a devastating blow to Papua New Guinea. But a lot of people were killed. A lot of people died as a result of this civil war. And my predecessor, Gareth Evans, had been involved with trying to stop the fighting there and with the New Zealanders. So I inherited that work. And eventually we managed, working with the Papua New Guineans and the Bougainvillean leadership itself, to broker a peace agreement and bring the conflict to an end.
And the peace agreement gave them considerable autonomy.
Yeah,
right.
And the prospect of independence through a referendum,
which has not yet happened.
It's about to happen.
It is about to happen. Okay, wow, how interesting.
It seemed like a good idea at the time, but now the time for the referendum has finally come. And there's a real risk, and I call it a risk because I think it would be a bad outcome. There's a real risk that they could vote for independence and create a very small country.
Yeah, I think we're all very wary of referendums these days.
Well, they're great if you get the result you want, and they're not so good if you don't.
Right.
You have to live with that.
But I suppose that dealing with that basically nationalist challenge, secessionist challenge, prepared you to deal with your next one in East Timor, which did eventually get independence.
Yeah, so here you have a situation with Indonesia, which back in the 1970s, sort of 74, 5, had invaded East Timor. And after the Portuguese Revolution, it was a Portuguese colony. And they invaded East Timor to take it over because they feared that the East Timorese would set up a communist government. That was a big issue in those days, of course, and that East Timor would become a kind of Cuba to Indonesia. So that was Suharto's thinking. So they took over East Timor and incorporated it into Indonesia. And the Australian government went along with that, eventually, a few years later, formally recognising East Timor as part of the Republic of Indonesia, which many countries didn't recognise. And so the real turning point was 1998, when there was a major meltdown in the Asian economies, and Indonesia's economy contracted by 14% in that 1 year. You can imagine the devastating impact that had. President Suharto, the dictator of Indonesia, resigned, was replaced by his vice president, Habibie. We thought, well, this East Timor problem just goes on and on and on. We would, first of all, consult the East Timorese and find out what they really wanted. Do they really want independence? Did they want wide-ranging autonomy of the kind I've been talking about in relation to Bougainville? And if they wanted autonomy, what would be the basis of it? So we consulted them.
How did you do that?
We did it by talking to community leaders, both within East Timor and in the East Timorese diaspora in Australia and Portugal.
And that the we was Australian diplomats?
Australian diplomats, yeah.
So you fanned out across the country and interviewed many, many people.
Yes, fanned probably isn't the right way of putting it, but we did, yeah. We interviewed many people. Our judgment from those interviews was that ultimately they did want independence, but thinking of what I just said about Bougainville, they were prepared to accept autonomy, but only for a limited period. So we wrote to what became President Habibie to tell him the results of this work that we had done. I also spoke to the foreign minister of the time, Ali Alatas, and said to President Habibie, probably the best way forward for you is to grant East Timor wide-ranging autonomy, which is the language of the time, with the prospect of a referendum in 5 or 10 years' time to see how they like it. And he didn't like that. He said, no, well, if that's the view of the Australian government, which has always supported us on the East Timor issue, then we'll have the referendum straight away.
The Indonesians said that.
Yeah.
Huh. Why did they say that? Did they think they were going to win?
They definitely did.
And why would they think that?
Because the army, which was fairly heavily deployed in East Timor, judged that would be the result. So I never take political advice from the military, by the way, would be one piece of
but they didn't believe
experience that I've learned.
But they didn't believe in your consultations. They thought you didn't do it right, or they thought people weren't telling you the truth.
Yeah, so it's not an opinion poll, the consultations. It's just what various sort of community leaders thought. I can't remember how many people, probably 200, something like that.
That's really a punt that they took, huh? That's a bit risky.
They definitely thought that if they had a referendum and the East Timorese voted for wide-ranging autonomy to stick with Indonesia, that would be the end of the issue, because there'd been a lot of fighting in East Timor, sort of terrorist attacks and that sort of thing in support of independence. The army retaliating, and sometimes, of course, as you know, militaries can retaliate pretty brutally, and they did occasionally. So the referendum was finally held during 1999. I think it was September 1999.
Yep.
And even in an environment where voters were intimidated by militias who were funded and supported by the Indonesian army, they nevertheless voted like 72 or 3% for independence. So the Indonesian government, President Habibie, decided, well, that's it. They voted for independence, so they can have independence. The militias in East Timor then went completely feral.
Right, I remember that, yeah.
And burnt every built structure they could find in East Timor. Right. I mean, literally almost every building was burnt out, not necessarily burnt to the ground, but burnt out in East Timor as a result of this. And whilst for a while we begged the the Indonesians to send in the army to restore control there in East Timor.
Who controlled the militias?
So elements of the military. And the military was very divided. So there were elements of the military which were happy to carry out the president's direct instructions.
These were Indonesian military.
But there were elements of the Indonesian military which felt very resentful of what had happened in East Timor, and they supported the militias and supported the burning, didn't take action, stood by while a lot of the burning took place. I mean, these militias had been set up by the Indonesian army, TNI as it's known.
Right.
So we eventually persuaded, first of all, Kofi Annan and secondly, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus the rest, that the UN should set up and deploy a peacekeeping force, which they agreed to do subject to the agreement of President Habibie, who gave his agreement.
And then you sent
and we
many
led the
soldiers, right?
Not only did we lead it, we assembled it. So, I mean, part of my job at the time was to go around, particularly the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and try to collect troops to go.
And how many ended up going in at the start?
We sent in, I think, from memory, 5,000 troops alone. So it might have only been 6,000.
I mean, it's interesting because I was in Kosovo at the time where the UN had an interim administration, and the UN was the government for all sorts of reasons. And the same thing happened in East Timor. And was that because you didn't think the East Timorese, or you thought that they thought they needed help? I mean, why did they set up one there if they had really a local government? In Kosovo, it was more complicated.
Well, first of all, you had to, Kosovo is much more complicated. But so you didn't have that same ethnic division in East Timor. You had one substantial cleavage, and that was between those who continued to support integration with Indonesia and those who didn't. So it's one of these, so often the case in human affairs, where an economist can make an argument for why it's better for East Timor to be integrated with Indonesia, but people just don't feel emotionally that they want to be, even if there is a significant economic cost to pay. So that was the sort of division in East Timorese society. Obviously, the vast majority, not necessarily the elites, but the vast majority of the public wanted to go their own way as an independent country. So to move from being a province of Indonesia to being an independent country was going to require the establishment of institutions. All of that takes time. So the UN set up an interim administration, which was led by Sergio de Mello.
Right. I remember that. I'm just wondering why, in that case, they were happy for the UN to run East Timor versus having the East Timorese do it. And Kosovo is what I'm saying. And Kosovo made sense because there was an agreement that Kosovo would become independent. And so at that time, and so there were it was a big challenge in the UN with the Russians and others about could the Kosovo Albanians have full independence? And so it was a compromise to have the UN running Kosovo. Whereas in Indonesia and East Timor, it seemed that there was a local government. They needed support to build capacity.
There was no government.
Oh, there wasn't? Okay.
No.
Okay.
It was run by the Indonesians. The Indonesians appointed a governor. They have a governor in every province.
I see.
And I can't remember, but there was probably a consultative assembly. But essentially, the governor ran the province.
Okay. And
so they had to, first of all, they had to work out what sort of a constitution they wanted. They want a president, prime minister, parliament. What did they want? The UN helped them with that somewhat. We didn't really involve ourselves in that. And they came up with a very traditional structure. So the UN was only there temporarily just to help with the stabilization, manage the peacekeeping operation. You need police. There were no police.
Yeah, okay.
Can you imagine? The country was laid waste. Yeah. So you end up, the Indonesians walked out, but like literally walked out.
And that's what happened in Kosovo. The Serbs walked out. They left everything. So there was nobody running the electricity.
No.
All of that. There were just vacant jobs everywhere. No one running the airport. We had to put in a UN guy to run the airport.
Same.
Yeah.
No one ran the airport.
And in fact, I think there were people going back and forth between the two missions because I remember one of the, international governors of East Timor came over to Kosovo and I took him around to show him how we were doing things. Yeah. It's a bit crazy. I mean, in some senses, you don't really want foreigners running anything, right? You want the locals to do it. And I think we've learned generally it's a bad idea to have international administrations, but there may be some circumstances where you do need that kind of assistance.
Well, just dwelling on that theme reminds me of not many years later in 2003.
In Iraq, exactly.
I went to Baghdad. It would have been, the overthrow of Saddam Hussein was the end of March, early April. Right. So this must have been beginning of May. Right. 2003. I met with the Iraqi leadership at the Australian Embassy in Baghdad in the residence. I remember in this big dining room there, and these were the well-known figures who were consulted by the Americans.
Chalabi and people like that.
Yeah, exactly. And they unanimously said to me, you people, meaning the international community, thanks very much for liberating us from Saddam Hussein, but you're now making a huge mistake.
Yeah.
And that is that the Americans and you and the Brits are taking over and going to run our country, albeit on a temporary basis. You shouldn't be doing that. Yeah. You should let us run it.
Yeah, well, I'm amazed.
I went and saw Bremer, who was by then in situ, just his predecessor.
Jay Garner, had just left, right?
He had been fired. Although he was still physically there, I remember seeing him sit in the canteen in that ex-presidential palace in Baghdad. But anyway, I went and saw Bremer. And it's one of those experiences I've had in life where I can understand people not listening to a word I'm saying and think that I lack credibility and who would care what you think. But I passed on my reflections from this meeting that morning with the Iraqi leaders. And he was just completely dismissive and just moved on to other topics.
Look, they didn't listen to other Americans as well. So, I mean, this is what frustrated me about that period. We had relatively successful operations in Kosovo and East Timor, and a lot of people with experience, but the Bush administration didn't listen to anybody. And in fact, there was a story in a book that I helped put together where Donald Rumsfeld said, inside the Pentagon, when people were saying to him, we need to think about the day after in Iraq. And he said, the next time someone mentions phase 4, meaning the post-conflict period, they're fired. So they didn't listen to anybody, including the State Department even. I mean, so that's a huge frustration.
The biggest single mistake they made, we thought, in Australia, and I remember at the National Security Committee of our cabinet, we were talking about this because we were very worried about what was happening in Iraq. Not immediately after the fall of Baghdad. This would have been months later. The biggest single mistake they made was to hand the whole show over to the Pentagon. As John Howard said at that meeting, and I'm not betraying too many cabinet secrets here in this podcast, but as he said in that meeting, so Alexander, who is actually running Iraq? Because it looks a shambles. And I said, well, it's the Pentagon. It's the American military who are in effect running Iraq. And he said, God forbid that we would ever get our Defense Department to run a country. I mean, I think that's right. They are set up to fight wars, not to run countries.
Don't forget the fundamental tenet of any democracy is that there is civilian control over the military. So when the occupying power is not exercising that themselves, they're not practicing what they preach.
No. Well, there are all sorts of issues about military training and how it must be conducted, what skills military people must have, command and control, all these sorts of things, which are skills you need to fight wars. But they are not that is not the skill set you need to run a country, which is a different equation altogether.
I think they were thinking back then that they had referred a lot to the occupation of Germany and Japan at the end of the war. And of course, back then there was a military occupation and military leadership by the United States. And so I think they were looking back to that period and, but yes, I mean, all of that. But can I ask you something going back a bit? You did support the Iraq War. And was that because you didn't assume it would be botched up so badly afterwards?
We didn't. Well, there are lots of reasons why we supported it, but we certainly didn't work on the basis it would be botched up afterwards, as you so elegantly put it. So here am I sitting.
An obvious question, but
here am I sitting talking to you in London, and so often I was on the phone with my British counterpart, who was Jack Straw at the time. We'd become lifelong friends as a result of the Iraq War. And Colin Powell was the, very elegant Secretary of State, a great guy to deal with. And he used to sort of think that Jack Straw and I, before we ever met with him, had first of all consulted with each other. He said, it's something about you Commonwealth people. You always talk the same language. But I think Colin Powell agreed with us more than... Not knocking Donald Rumsfeld, by the way, is a very entertaining person to spend time with. Mm-hmm. But I don't think his political strategy was good.
Of course not. And Colin Powell was marginalized. I mean,
and he was marginalized.
And don't forget. I mean, the Americans had no real reckoning with what they did in Iraq. There was no Chilcot inquiry. There were some minor inquiries or a few books written, but there was nothing official was done here.
I'm not sure what the Chilcot inquiries ever achieved, in all honesty. I watched some of the public hearings on television. I smiled wryly at some of the things people said because, of course, I was involved and I knew exactly what had happened.
But people who made disastrous decisions weren't held to account. Some are even back in government, such as the new U.S. National Security Advisor. I mean, this is what is a bit frustrating about U.S. foreign policy.
I don't think he was involved in the Iraq War, though.
Oh, yeah, John Bolton was. He was a big supporter of it.
But I think he was something like the Assistant Secretary for Arms Control.
But he was still, behind the scenes pushing very hard and.
I think, in all honesty, we've got to be careful when we're analysing American politics not to draw too many long bows.
Yeah. I think the point here is that I was just reading Stephen Walt's new book, and I think a very good point he makes is that one of the big problems with U.S. foreign policy is there is never accountability for huge mistakes that are made. And in fact, many of the people who make those mistakes are often even promoted. And he goes through a number of cases. And of course, the Iraq War is a great example of that. And, many, many people died. Iraq is still a mess. I was just there a few months ago and, still suffering from the after shocks of a very bad occupation. And other countries at least try to have accountability. And I think that is one of the big challenges in the U.S. system is that there's really no reckoning when you make enormous mistakes.
Well, I think you've got to be very careful about that. It's all very well from the ivory tower of Harvard University to proclaim in such a way, but Let's put yourself in a position of being a decision maker. If you know that every decision you make is going to be subject to a huge backlash, particularly when you have to take difficult and risky decisions, well, you probably won't make the decision. So I think it would be a passport to American retreat from the world to have a policy like that. So what are we going to do? Set up a commission of inquiry into the Obama administration's handling of the Syria issue, which I think myself...
Well, they did do it for Benghazi, don't forget, with Hillary Clinton, right? And that didn't get anywhere.
And what's the point?
Right, that was more...
That was party politics.
Right, but I mean, I think...
party politics, as one of the... I mean, it's just a get Hillary occasion.
I think, though, if you don't want to keep repeating the mistakes and something incredibly... An enormous mistake is made, and the Iraq War was an enormous mistake. So people do need to be held accountable so you don't do it again, so people understand.
Well, I think the Syria policy was an enormous mistake.
Also.
But I don't know. President Obama got re-elected and then his term expired and all those people like John Kerry retired and we move on. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. No, I'm not sure. That there's a tradition in Australia, and it's only a convention really, that the succeeding government doesn't set up inquiries into the behaviour of its predecessors.
Yeah.
The present Australian government did originally set up a royal commission into something the Rudd government had done, and I thought it was quite wrong to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's why Obama didn't do anything on Iraq when he...
No. And I don't think Trump should do anything about Obama either, just move on.
Yeah. So was there anything else during your period as foreign secretary that stands out? Obviously there was a lot going on, but as big as some of those issues that we've just discussed.
Well, remember in the case of Iraq, we weren't a main player, or whether we'd been there, or whether we went there or not. It wasn't going to make a huge amount of difference. I'm sure our military did useful things, securing the Western Desert at the outbreak of the war to stop Scud missiles being fired into Israel and so on. But the Americans probably could have done that if they didn't have Australia to do the job for them. I mean, we were very much a follower in that, a bit player in that exercise. Where we were significant was in Southeast Asia, dealing with China, and in the South Pacific. So we talked a bit about Bougainville. The Solomon Islands started to fall apart. We sent in the military. So we sent in the army and we restored order in the Solomon Islands. We set up what's called Ramsey, the Regional Assistance Mission in the Solomon Islands, which helped the government in the Solomon Islands run the country. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a case where an intervention has worked really well. Ramsey has now withdrawn from Solomon Islands, withdrew at the end of 2017. And the country is essentially quite stable these days. So, it's not a very big country, but going into other countries with your military, putting them back into order and leaving, it's quite a big challenge.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a bit about your time as High Commissioner here, because, of course, you arrived long before the referendum was even envisaged. You did have to deal with two referendums. So you dealt with the Scottish referendum. Then you ended up dealing with Brexit. Certainly saw a number of terrorist attacks here and elsewhere in Europe caused by the so-called Islamic State, Grenfell Towers. A number of really important big issues happened during your period here. I don't know, do you have any...
Two general elections.
Two general elections, too. That's quite a lot for a High Commissioner to deal with. But obviously you were a very experienced High Commissioner. Your father had been High Commissioner here before, which is also quite interesting. So just maybe a few reflections about your time here and your thoughts.
Well,
we'll get to Brexit a bit later. But
yeah, well, my father was the High Commissioner here when Britain joined the European Union, and I was here when they voted to leave. So their experience in the European Union was, as we like to say, bookended by the Downer family. Not that I think anybody outside of the Downer family would know that. Yes, my time here was, I felt very productive. It was a time when we were really able to build up the Anglo-Australian relationship quite substantially.
Yeah.
It obviously has very strong people-to-people links, but the political links between our two countries, military links between our two countries, they've really drifted. The intelligence links are very close, very intimate. That's always worked very well. But I wanted to build up the political links, and I think with William Hague, who was the Foreign Secretary when I first came here, was very committed to building that relationship with Australia through to his various successors, Philip Hammond and Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was still the Foreign Secretary, I guess, when I finished as the High Commissioner. We advanced the relationship very, very substantially. And why wouldn't we? Because from Australia's point of view, having a kind of, it's a bit of a hackneyed phrase, but a kind of special relationship with a country on the other side of the world, which of course shares our cultural outlook and our values, is a huge force multiplier for our diplomacy. So when it comes to, everything from candidates elected to UN positions to coordinating our positions on broader international issues on the South China Sea or Kosovo or whatever it might be, basically we consult each other, and we are invariably going to take the same position and support each other if we're a bit indifferent to an issue that the British regard as very important, like the Falkland Islands. Well, our default position will be just to support them because, they're our team.
Right.
So I wouldn't underestimate the value of that, and I really pushed that very hard. The other thing is the people-to-people links are incredibly important. There are more British-born people living in Australia than in any other country in the world, other than Britain, of course.
Wow.
And there are more British-born people living in Australia than in the whole of the EU 27. So
how interesting.
One Australian in 20 was born in the UK.
Wow. But there are a number of Australians here as well. So
hard to know how many. There are 150,000 or so registered. But then over and above that, there are the dual nationals. So if you took anybody who has an Australian passport, there's probably anything up to 500,000 of them, 400,000 perhaps living in the UK. And of course, they're in all sorts of prominent positions here.
Right.
There are Australians in the House of Commons. There are
the Philharmonic. The London Philharmonic isn't the head of that in Australia.
Yes. There are, and look, any manner of different organisations, people in the arts, the media, and so on.
Yeah. Okay, well, now let's talk a bit about Brexit. Because I remember when, prior to the referendum, you were obviously still High Commissioner, and I think the official line was that Australia, like Japan and other countries, was against it because you felt that the UK was, in a sense, a gateway to the rest of Europe.
We didn't think it was a gateway. We don't need a gateway. If we, I've often explained this to people. If our businesses, for example, want to operate in Europe, they just set up in Europe.
But you were against it, weren't you? Or at least the official position was against it.
Yeah. So our position was a geopolitical position. We thought that the UK in the European Union, as the second biggest country in the European Union, and the country, by the way, with the greatest geopolitical influence in the European Union, we thought that the UK was a force for trade and economic liberalism in an organisation which is have mixed views on that issue. We thought, given the huge geopolitical reach of the UK, we thought the UK made the European Union much more outward-looking because the sort of default Brussels position is the reverse. It's very introverted, very inward-focused. We thought the UK in the European Union made the European Union more transatlantic. So take the UK out. Whatever happens to the UK, we weren't so much focused on that. We didn't think that would have a huge effect in the short term, one way or the other, on the UK. But we thought that it would weaken very substantially, the European Union. And the European Union would be a more difficult partner for us.
Right.
And I think that I still think that is true. I mean, there are a whole series of different arguments about what it means for the UK. But in terms of the European Union, the Europeans never say this. I don't know why, but they never do. But I think that Europe is substantially weaker without the UK as a member. But then, and I think it's weaker intellectually. Yeah. I think it's weaker in policy terms and geopolitically. The only other country with substantial geopolitical outreach is France. Right. That's still, of course, very much at the heart of the European project. But the rest of the countries don't have a geopolitical perspective.
Right. No, I hear that from a lot of Europeans. The big concern is not about the financial contribution. It's about Britain's, influence in a number of areas.
The economics will sort itself out. Right. I've made this point over and over again. In the end, number one, people didn't vote to leave the European Union in the UK because of economics. Mm-hmm. And I explained a little while ago talking about East Timor. Sure, the best economic outcome for East Timor was to remain as part of the Republic of Indonesia. But people have a sense of identity and they would rather, even if it's going to cost them, they would rather their independence. And clearly that kind of mindset is abroad here in the UK. Who am I to criticise it? That's just what an awful lot of people, not a big majority apparently, mm-hmm. but it's what an awful lot of people think. So because a lot of people think it, I respect it. Economics isn't everything. Yeah. And in any case, if the UK ever does leave the European Union and how it leaves, the economics will quickly adjust. The supply chains for manufacturers, of course, they will adjust and, they'll put in place computerized programs to deal with tariffs and so on. All of these things there'll be a period of adjustment, mm-hmm. which will be disruptive, but all of these things will adjust. What won't adjust is the geopolitics of Europe. That cannot be adjusted. Mm-hmm. So taking Europe's most important geopolitical player out of the European Union will leave the European Union substantially diminished. Mm-hmm. That's what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. But your own views have also evolved, I think, because you realize that Australia could benefit from closer economic relations with the UK post-Brexit as well.
Yeah, look, from Australia's point of view, this is a win-win. We can negotiate a free trade agreement with the European Union, which will probably not be a very high-quality one because the European Union in trade is very protectionist, mm-hmm.
Particularly
agricultural trade. So they'll make some concessions to us, but it won't be a huge benefit, but it'll be a benefit. We, on the other hand, could also negotiate a bilateral free trade agreement with the United Kingdom, which could be a much more high-quality agreement than the one we would get with the EU, because the UK instinctively and inherently is a more free trading country. From Australia's point of view, Brexit probably is a marginal plus, actually. Mm-hmm. Unless you weigh up Australia being a bit of a loser from the weakening of the European Union, and the European Union will be a harder partner for us to engage mm-hmm. without the UK.
Right.
Yeah, something like 7% of the UK's trade was with Australia before Britain joined the European Union, and now it's like 1.5 or 2% or something.
Right.
Why? Well, because the EU is a preferential trading bloc. So it's easier for them to trade with the EU than it is with countries outside of the EU because of the single market and the customs union.
Right. Okay. Well, that's all very interesting. Maybe talk a little bit about your post-official life, the next stage in your career. And then I think we're going to have to stop fairly soon because we've been going on for some time, but it's been a fascinating conversation. And obviously we can't cover everything. You've had such a rich life, but a little bit about what you're doing at King's College, perhaps.
Yeah, so at King's College, I'm setting up what's called the International School for Government, which is providing initially online, but as time goes on, executive education programs at master's level, targeting mid-level civil servants, basically saying to mid-level civil servants, you need to be skilled in a whole raft of contemporary trends. So you need to understand digitisation, the benefits of digitisation in the public sector, but you need to understand what the risks are and the downside to digitisation, obviously privacy issues and all those sorts of questions that have to be managed and sometimes are difficult to manage. You need to understand how social media works and how the more broader, more conventional media works. You need to understand as a civil service how to deal with that. Mm-hmm. How do you engage with the public, with a public which is much more educated than it used to be, but is therefore much more restless,
right.
Less deferential, more self-confident, and with access to social media.
Or access to different types of information. Maybe they're not getting the same information too. I mean, now news is so bifurcated during this, I mean, do you talk about that a bit? In other words,
so
depending on your political beliefs, you can only read stuff that appeals to you. You don't have to read anything that doesn't. Do you get...
Yes, this is this sort of echo chamber theory.
Do you try to bring that into the...
Yes,
I think that's important probably for diplomats to know more
Yes, it's important to understand how important social media is. I mean, to what extent should you take it seriously? I've noticed a lot of corporates reacting very quickly to attacks on them in social media. They're probably making a mistake because this is just echo chamber stuff. This probably doesn't reflect a broader community view. They particularly react to Twitter. Mm-hmm. Twitter, of course, is starting to decline now. Mm. And Twitter is the great platform for the foul-mouthed.
Mm-hmm. And the ADD.
Yes, ADD.
I know I'm bouncing around a little bit, but I do want to ask you as well about your views on China and China emerging as a global power and how to really, all different sorts of countries can manage that rise. I mean, this is one area where I'm less critical of Trump because I think he is pushing back, and so many other U.S. administrations were reluctant to do so. And, China's just going from strength to strength. And so I think that all sorts of countries from middle powers to the United States are really struggling with how to manage China's rise.
So this is the biggest geopolitical challenge of our time. We've been talking about a little bit about the Middle East and about Brexit in Europe. But those issues pale into insignificance compared to the rise of China. Mm-hmm. And I think looked at from London, it's hard often to get that perspective. Perhaps that perspective is clearer in Washington.
Yeah.
So there are do's and don'ts here. Don't pursue a policy of containment of China. To call China your enemy is to make China your enemy. That's completely nuts to do that. It's important to work with China, to embrace China in the international system, and particularly to say to China, we expect you, like everyone else, to adhere to the rules-based international system, but you're a huge power. You obviously have a role to play in making the rules for the rules-based international system, but there's due process to be followed. So that is an important component of managing China. I wouldn't be too paranoid about China. Mm-hmm. I know that they launch, including the MSS, the Ministry of State Security, launch cyber attacks from time to time, and the Chinese should be, as they use the trope of the era, called out for that. I think we're right to say you shouldn't be doing this, guys, and we know what you are doing, and we know. So let's cut that out. They should be careful about transgressing into the domestic politics of other countries. That, in Australia, they don't get into whether the Liberal Party or the Labor Party should be the government or anything like that. But they have been, getting a bit closer to MPs and other figures of influence in our society than perhaps is appropriate.
Which is interesting because they're always calling out other countries for interfering.
Yes, a policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries is one of their slogans, which is sort of up to a point. I mean, to a point, fair enough.
Every country does that.
And I also think, so sometimes I do think Donald Trump is right, and sometimes I think he's wrong.
Yeah.
I think the worst thing about Donald Trump is the language he uses and the divisive way he handles his political opponents. There is opponents, that's a given. But I think to be honest with you, when you're the president of the United States, you're the president of all Americans, and you don't have to accept the critique of his Democratic opponents and spear throws for the Democrats, but you just got to be careful with the language you use in fighting back against them. His pushbacks are often too fierce and too aggressive. However, that doesn't mean that everything he says and everything he does is wrong.
Right.
He is right. The United States market is much more open to China than the Chinese market is to America. The European market is, the American market is much more open to Europeans than the European market is to Americans. And his point is, look, you should open up your markets. And if you don't, well, we're not going to be as generous in the future as we've been in the past. I'm sorry.
Right,
I don't think that passes first-year economics.
Right.
On the other hand, I know that the Democrats are much more protectionist than the Republicans. So I don't look to the Democrats for salvation here. And if Trump can get the Chinese to reduce their levels of protection and to open up the Chinese market more for investors, and there are signs that that is happening, then that's going to be a good thing. And hopefully he won't feel it necessary to go ahead with his own tariff increases against China.
No, it would be a huge accomplishment. I think that the other issue has always been that China owns so much of America's debt. And so they do have America in a bit of a corner as well. But in terms of...
Yes, they probably, I'm not sure how much it is, but they probably own $1 or $2 trillion worth of American debt. Although Americans would own most of American debt, I guess.
Right, but it's still an interesting situation to be in. But the other issue I wanted to ask you about is, get your ideas on, is that there are indications that in terms of pushing back on China's control over IP or over technology transfer, that they're willing to, they claim anyway, they're willing to change. But do you believe that they will? Or do you think they're just saying that?
Well, they've said that for years.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when Madeleine Albright was the Secretary of State, and she and I would go along to APEC meetings, and she would make all of these points to the Chinese at the APEC meetings. And, you know, that in those days, this is in the 1990s, the Chinese were building automobiles which were direct copies of American cars. I mean, you know.
Right.
No intellectual property apparently was too sacred for the Chinese. They would steal anything.
Right.
They say they don't do that. They've made laws against doing that. Maybe individuals do it, but they have made laws against it. But it's going to be very important that they continue, the Chinese administration continues to crack down and not, for example, assist with cyber spying, corporate cyber spying, which is obviously undermining the integrity of the international intellectual property system.
Let me ask you, speaking of Madeleine Albright, I just have 3 more questions for you. I understand that in 2000 at the ASEAN Summit, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that you sang a song, Mambo Number 5, and including you said something a little bit not so subtle to Madeleine Albright. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about that story? I had no idea that people did this karaoke every time at the ASEAN
meetings. They don't
meetings.
anymore. It's been because a lot of humorless, fun-hating foreign ministers have replaced the Madeleine Albrights and Alexander Downers of this world. Well, Condi Rice was in for it. She didn't used to sing. She used to play the piano. Colin Powell famously...
did the Village People, didn't he?
He did something with the Japanese foreign minister. He sang...
YMCA, didn't he sing YMCA?
No, he sang that song... El Paso.
Okay.
Do you remember that song?
Are you going to sing it for us?
No, but it's about a girl in El Paso.
So at every ASEAN meeting,
it was great entertainment. There was a Russian foreign minister who'd also been the Russian prime minister called Primakov, and Primakov and Madeleine Albright did West Side Story. It was an absolute classic. I did 1 year Mambo number 5 years. There's some words about Madeleine Albright.
But it's interesting because this is before cell phones had cameras, right?
No, probably. Well, that might have been.
Yeah.
But So I remember going off to one of these ASEAN meetings, coming back home at the weekend and going out to play golf with my son. We played a round of golf and went into the clubhouse to get a drink. And as I walked into the clubhouse, there must have been 50 or 60 people there. They all looked around at me coming in and all started jeering and shouting and saying, "Don't give up your day job," which was a reference to the fact that they'd seen me on TV singing.
I see. Okay, so there was the camera there. But I can't end this podcast without asking you about the George Papadopoulos link. Yeah. I know we wouldn't even know who he was if it weren't for you. I know people can also go and look up the story, but are there any remarks you want to make about that very crazy story?
It sure is. I mean, it was just a random decision, really, that one of my staff asked if I'd be interested in meeting somebody who was on the Trump foreign policy team, or at least claimed to be. And I didn't have much time. I said, well, why don't we catch up with him for a drink on the way home? Because this diplomat from the Australian High Commission, she lived quite near me. So we went off and went to this bar, the Kensington Wine Bar, which she chose. And we had a drink with him there for about an hour. The New York Times described it as an alcohol-fueled evening. Well, I think we had... It's arguable whether we had 1 or 2 gin and tonics each, but you know how powerful a gin and tonic is in a bar. You don't get much gin. It's a tonic and ice with a dash of gin. So we certainly didn't leave the bar after 1 hour inebriated, and it would have been at 7 o'clock that I left. Yes, I think we all might have left at the same time. I certainly left. And he talked a lot about what Trump's foreign policy would be. This was at a time when, so I think it might have been in around May 2016, before Trump had won the nomination. So have I got the right year there? Yes, 2016.
16. 16, because he was elected at the end of 2016.
2016,
right?
Gosh, yes, how time flies. Yes, that's right. So it would have been about May 2016. We had a sense from the media that Trump would be a president who would withdraw from the world and an isolationist. And this guy Papadopoulos said, well, just none of that was true, that he was a man who would be prepared to use America's military, not as enthusiastically as George W. Bush, but with greater enthusiasm than Obama. He said that he would want to continue to be heavily engaged in the world. Insofar as you could take this guy as a credible advisor, we had no idea whether he was or he wasn't. Apparently, the Trump people say he was just a coffee boy, which is fair enough. Maybe he was. But anyway, what he said was sort of half interesting. And he seemed friendly enough. And at the end of it, we asked him, it might have been I asked him whether he thought Trump would win the Republican nomination. He was very confident about that. And I said, well, what about the general election against Hillary Clinton? That'd be pretty hard going, wouldn't it? And he said he thought that Trump would win. A couple of reasons. But he said, in any case, the Russians might use some material they have on Hillary, and that will do her a lot of damage. And I didn't really ask him anything more about that. I just thought, gosh, really? I wonder what that sort of material they could have on Hillary Clinton that would be so damaging.
And how would he know?
Yeah, did you really ask that? Yeah. Of course, it's become a huge issue now, and there's a Mueller inquiry and so on. And that was it. I just reported it, and obviously, we are in the Five Eyes arrangement with the Americans, and that sort of thing got to the American intelligence people. What do I think about it? I don't think anything about it, really. It's just what he said, and I just passed it on. He has come up, I can see, with a whole raft of different conspiracies. One of them being, by the way, that I recorded the whole the whole encounter on my cell phone. But on the other hand, he denies that he said anything about the Russians. Well, if I recorded the whole thing on my cell phone, I'd be able to prove him wrong.
Right.
I don't know whether he thought about that. I didn't record it, though, by the way. But we did do a report the next day, and I didn't do it. The diplomat who was with me, she did the report the next day and did include the reference to the Russians in it. So obviously we didn't make that up.
But you didn't think at the time to ask him, why would you know that the Russians have anything? I mean, that seems to be even crazier than what the Russians might have. Or did you just think he was a young kid kind of bragging about stuff? Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
We didn't really know whether to take him terribly seriously or not, in all honesty.
Right.
I mean, he's pretty young.
Right.
He seemed, smart enough. But when we talked about him afterwards, we thought, he seemed a nice guy, straightforward sort of a bloke, but very inexperienced person to be part of a foreign policy team. So I wasn't overly surprised to see he was described later as a coffee boy.
Right.
Maybe he was. That seems to be an attempt to put him down. I think that more likely there will be some interest in Trump's financial relationship with Russian banks going back to 2008-9. I think that's likely to be of greater interest to Mueller and his inquiry than any of this stuff in the lead up to the election.
Possibly. Okay, my last question. What advice would you give to the next generation who are thinking about a career in whether it's foreign policy, politics, the field of security, defense, foreign affairs generally?
Well, if you want to get into those areas, which are inherently very interesting, it's really important to think through, particularly if you want to go into politics, to think through what you really believe and feel about different issues and the direction of your country. Don't go near politics if you're not a person of some conviction. However you acquire those convictions, far be it for anybody to lecture you on how you acquire your convictions. But however you acquire your convictions, politics is for people of conviction. There's no greater way you can serve your country than as one of its political leaders. There's no doubt about that. And there is no occupation which brings more attacks, assaults and abuse than politics. So if you are of weak conviction, you're really sure what's right and what's wrong, you're just not quite sure. But it's interesting politics. That's not the job for you.
Or thin skin, presumably.
Well, if you are a person of conviction, then the attacks on you will be rubber bullets off a Sherman tank. If you're a person without conviction, they will penetrate your skin and they will drive you crazy. You'll become I think it's a job to keep well away from for many people because it's very, very depressing to have people attacking you and attributing to you all kinds of motives for why you do things, which are just unbelievable. I mean, as if I would ever be that bad. I mean, I'm bad, but would I ever be quite that bad? But anyway, I mean, I noticed on Twitter today, people still saying I should be executed. I should be sent to Guantanamo Bay, that I'm a criminal. Yeah. So what does it matter?
So your parents were not right. You were not soft.
I'm very sensitive, but I'm mainly sensitive about other people.
Okay. Well, Alexander Downer, it's been a huge pleasure. There's still so much more to talk about, but I think it's always better to leave the listeners wanting more. He's pouring water again. Thank you. Thank you again for joining us today.
It's a great pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for our podcast with the Honourable Alexander Downer, the former Australian Foreign Minister, as well as the former High Commissioner from Australia to the United Kingdom. In our next podcast, we will be meeting with Lord Peter Ricketts, the former National Security Advisor, as well as Ambassador to France.
This podcast was produced by Tom Ascott, developed by Caroline Tranter, with further research from Neil Watling. Keep up to date with the latest defence and security analysis by visiting www.rusi.org.